taking questions from you guys. So as with all of our webinars, if you look for the little comment box inside the webinar interface, you're welcome to type in any question that you have during the webinar, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. If we don't get to all of them, just make sure that you're registered for the actual webinar, and then after the fact, you'll receive a follow-up email containing all of the questions and answers that we've received during the webinar. So without further ado, I'm privileged to introduce our guest speaker today, Todd Martz. He is the co-author of the CastAway curriculum. So Todd is an associate professor at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So welcome, thanks for coming, Todd.
Thanks, Shua.
So Todd, I've had the privilege of knowing Todd for I think the last decade or so. And Todd is really a scientist who I've admired greatly for his innovative approaches to technology and instrumentation, especially as it applies to ocean chemistry. So Todd, would you mind telling the audience a little bit about what you do at Scripps, the roles you play, and your research projects or interests?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me. So like Shua said, I teach marine chemistry at Scripps, and my primary focus has been chemical sensor development. And if you're familiar with the Durafet pH sensors, my group has done a lot of work on developing sensor packages, including the CFET and the CFOX, which are commercial products through Seabird. But we've also done work with other things, and we've been using the CastAway over the last several years. So this is how we sort of got pulled into developing some classroom activities centered around the CastAway.
Cool.
So I'll have a few slides that we just put together here showing, I think the first slide is some recent field data. So we initially started using it for a couple of scientific applications, and it turns out at Scripps that Andreas Anderson's group has used the CastAway that resides in my lab. They've used it extensively, more than we have, in fact. And this is a really nice data set that I just saw for the first time about a week ago. A graduate student, Sam, in Andreas's lab provided this. And this is a depth resolved time series of temperature collected right off the Scripps pier. So what you're looking at here are 4 different contour plots that correspond to the 4 different locations seen in the upper left-hand corner. So they go out and they're doing a biogeochemical time series. So once a month they collect bottles, they analyze it for CO2 and other chemicals, and at the same time they're using a CastAway to augment their data set by doing temperature salinity profiles. So the 4 time series profiles you see, if you notice on the y-axis, they're all to different depths. So this corresponds to increasing depth as you go offshore. And Sam has really shown the seasonality and just the temperature here and the stratification and maybe other physical processes going on just in temperature. And of course, there's also a corresponding salinity data set that goes along with this. So just one application where people at Scripps have been using CastAway. I personally have used it in the field on one trip and was pleased with its results. So then had a graduate student, which we'll talk about shortly, who started working toward high school curriculum to use the CastAway. So you'll take a look at, I guess, the next slide, which is Shua's.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Todd. So it looks like Todd has quite a bit of breadth of knowledge and experience with the CastAway, so he's perfect for presenting the material today. So before we get into the actual details of the CastAway curriculum, I just wanted to go over a couple operational aspects or specifications on the actual instrument. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but in case you're not, just very quickly, the CastAway is a CTD, so it's meant to profile conductivity, temperature, and pressure. And just to give you an idea of the ranges that we're able to measure, temperature, you can measure a range from -5 to positive 45 degrees Celsius, and then conductivity 0 to 100,000 microsiemens per centimeter. This corresponds to a salinity of up to about 42. And then battery life, we have about 40 hours of continuous battery life. This kind of depends on whether you have the LCD, the colorful screen turned on or not. and how many times you're actually pinging the GPS. But this is run on 2 AA batteries, and then the sampling rate is 5 hertz, and so that goes for all the data, the temperature, conductivity, and the pressure. And then with communications, just simply with Bluetooth, so it's a wireless communication, and then the maximum depth that we're able to profile is 100 meters. And so just a little bit of background on why we chose to create a curriculum in the first place. The CastAway customers really have shown us that there's a wide range of uses for the CastAway. And because of its simple operation, it really lends to many different applications. And so users are able to quickly and easily collect and view data in the field. And we've seen over the years many examples of projects involving citizen science. So that means science where the actual data are collected by people who have a non-scientific background or very little experience doing science. And so an example here that I'm showing is called Fjord Fido. You might have heard of it. It's run by a graduate student at Scripps, Allison Lee, who's pictured in the photo in the lower right. And what these citizen science projects do is, well, this Fjord Fido project in particular, they're taking eco-tourists around the Antarctic and showing them how to use scientific tools to collect data. Then these tourists actually go out and collect the data for research projects and the data analysis that's required for an actual rigorous scientific study. So in this whole citizen science process, you do a lot of teaching to people with non-scientific backgrounds. And the CastAway was really an ideal tool for these guys. And so we thought, well, the CastAway is being used for this sort of application, why not use the CastAway as a formal teaching tool in the classroom? So that's kind of how the curriculum was hatched. And so now, Todd, if you wouldn't mind just explaining, a general overview and some details on the curriculum itself.
Sure. So part of Shannon's work as a master's student at Scripps was she was very focused on developing exercises initially for ocean acidification as a topic, but we also started to think about salinity because it's so much easier to make salinity measurements, and that was around the same time that CastAway became available. So we started thinking about how we could incorporate CastAway into some simple curriculum, and this is kind of the three-part idea that Shannon and I came up with. And it's the first thing you'll notice if you see the full document is that it's very focused on chemical oceanography, which is that's what you'd expect from a marine chemist. So we have some exercises that are just simply class exercises that can be done without a CastAway. But the three bullets here are that we first have a few topics just kind of dealing with the concept of residence time, which is usually one of the very first topics that we talk about in the marine chemistry class that I teach. So all of these things draw from the first-year graduate marine chemistry class that I teach at Scripps. The second is a field component, trying to collect some data using a CastAway with a class in the field. And admittedly, I think this is still, I would consider a work in progress. We're trying to figure out what the best approach is for different classes, but the real requirement here is that you have seawater accessible in one way or another to your class. So it could mean in some cases people would think about doing a point measurement, whereas ideally you'd like to go out and do a profile off of a pier or even perhaps a research vessel. And then the third would be we have some simple exercises where we ask the students to look at the data they collected and compare this to historical data that they could find online, thinking about salinity. And I guess we have a note here that says we welcome feedback on the curriculum and how it works in your classroom. I don't think this has actually been tested in a classroom yet, but Shannon did she did a little bit of a test with the ocean acidification curriculum that she developed, but to my knowledge, it hasn't really been tested yet in a classroom. So we're at the very early stages of developing this lesson plan.
Yeah. So like Todd said, if you have any suggestions, if you try this out and one part of the activity works or doesn't work or could stand for improvement, just please let us know. We're open to changes.
So this is the first part. We'll just kind of scroll through a few slides here that show the 3 different parts. But in the introduction to salinity, we again take the chemical view and go through a couple of lecture topics and talk about things related to salinity, including the periodic table and how it relates to the elements